The year was 1593. Less than 6 decades had passed since Henry VIII split from the Catholic Church, and Parliament had outlawed any religious gatherings that weren't Anglican, which was the religion of England. This was bad for the local Puritans as they were on the chopping block, and they had to leave as soon as possible. In 1608, the Puritans finally had enough and fled to the Netherlands. There, they had their self-imposed exile for 12 years, but they started getting paranoid that they were slowly losing their English culture if they stayed any longer. But they couldn't go back to England and face persecution, and they had nowhere else to go. Keep in mind, this is Europe coming fresh out of the Protestant Reformation and one leading up to the 30 Years' War. Having a different religion compared to everyone else was a big old no-no. There was also the looming threat of war due to the ongoing Dutch War of Independence against Spain. Fortunately, there were other options. In 1607, the English founded a colony in Virginia called Jamestown, and in 1614, the Dutch had founded their colony further north called New Amsterdam. So some of the Puritans decided to leave the Netherlands, return to England, and in 1620, 102 Pilgrims, 44 Puritans, and 78 others got into a ship called the Mayflower and began their journey to the New World. Their plan was to land in Jamestown and settle near the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam. However, due to bad weather, they ended up landing further north than what they expected, landing in what would eventually become Massachusetts. Flashing sideways, the natives already living in that area were under the Wampanoag Confederacy, creating sometime prior to the 1600s. The Wampanoag Confederacy was created in response to the Iroquois Confederacy, a neighboring state near Lake Ontario. The Iroquois would eventually become the enemy of the Wampanoag, as well as the Narragansett, but they were also part of the same confederacy. By the early 1600s, the Wampanoag, though barely coming in contact with Europeans, did have to deal with their shenanigans. When the French came to North America, they encouraged their Native American trade partners to expand their territory so they can get more fur, which they could use to trade for European items. And the only place they could expand to was into Wampanoag land. Back to the Pilgrims, they arrived in December of 1620, only to go through a disastrous winter, killing many in the process. Eventually, in the spring of 1621, the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag came in contact with each other through Samoset, who had came to the Wampanoag Confederacy during a diplomatic mission between the Wampanoag and the Abenaki, a separate group of people from New Hampshire. He talked to the Pilgrims in English, which he learned from speaking with English fishermen on the Mohegan Island off the coast of Maine. Samoset would eventually introduce the Pilgrims to another Native American, Tisquantum, or Squanto, who had originally been a member of the Patuxet tribe before he was kidnapped to England, only to escape back to his homeland. Samoset also introduced the Pilgrims to the chief of the Wampanoag, Osaquin, or Massasoit, and with the help of the Wampanoag, the Pilgrims were able to get back on their feet, officially setting up the colony of Plymouth. And to give thanks, the Pilgrims had a 3-day feast after the harvest in the fall of 1621. The Wampanoag and the Pilgrims made a peace deal, mainly for protection against the other Native Americans, and the peace held for another half-century before the King Philip's War. The end.